He married her on a reckless dare, thinking it was just a game. But on their wedding night, one shocking discovery turned his whole world upside down, and there was no turning back. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel buzzed with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses as the city's elite mingled under the golden glow of chandeliers. It was one of those nights where wealth dripped from every conversation and every smile masked an ulterior motive. At the center of it all stood Alexander Sinclair, the heir to the Sinclair empire, a billion-dollar conglomerate spanning real estate, tech, and luxury brands. Dressed in an impeccable black tuxedo, his dark, chiseled features and piercing blue eyes made him the most desirable bachelor in the room. But for Alexander, these events were nothing more than a game, a place where he played his role, kept up appearances, and indulged in mindless distractions. At the bar, his best friend and business partner, Damian Crawford, smirked as he took a sip of his whiskey. Another night, another queue of women dying to be your wife, he mused, nodding towards a group of socialites eyeing Alexander with not-so-subtle interest. Alexander chuckled, swirling his own glass. You'd think they'd at least pretend to be interested in me and not just my last name. Damian's smirk widened. Well, if you want excitement, why don't we make things interesting tonight? Alexander raised an eyebrow. Oh? Damian leaned in, his voice lower now. I dare you to marry someone unexpected. No heiresses, no models, no one from our world. Pick someone random. Shock the entire city. Alexander scoffed. And why the hell would I do that? Because, Damian grinned, you love a challenge and you're bored. Besides, imagine the headlines. Billionaire Sinclair marries a nobody on a dare. It would be legendary. Alexander shook his head, amused. And what do I get if I win this ridiculous dare? Damian's eyes gleamed mischievously. $10 million to any charity of your choice. Plus, you get to break out of your usual routine for once. Alexander exhaled, glancing around the room. The same faces, the same rehearsed conversations. Perhaps Damian was right. He was bored. Fine, Alexander said, setting his glass down with finality. Let's play. Now all he needed was her. Across the ballroom, Isla Monroe stood near the balcony, completely out of place. She wasn't supposed to be here. The only reason she had been invited was because her friend, Sophie, worked for a high-profile designer who had needed extra help setting up for the evening. Dressed in a borrowed gown, midnight blue satin hugging her delicate frame, Isla felt like a ghost in a world she didn't belong to. Unlike the women around her, draped in diamonds and privilege, she had no interest in wealthy suitors or power plays. She was here for one reason, to keep Sophie company and enjoy the view before vanishing back into her quiet life. But fate had other plans. Excuse me. The deep, rich voice made her turn. And there he was, Alexander Sinclair. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence commanded the space effortlessly. Isla recognized him instantly. Who didn't know the heir to the Sinclair fortune? But why was he talking to her? I need a dance partner, Alexander said smoothly, extending his hand. Join me? Isla hesitated, glancing around as if waiting for the punchline. Me? Yes, you, he confirmed, amusement flickering in his striking blue eyes. She could have said no, should have said no, but something in his gaze, something unreadable and oddly challenging, made her step forward and take his hand. The moment their fingers touched, a strange electricity pulsed through her, leaving her momentarily breathless. As he led her onto the dance floor, the room buzzed with whispers. Who is she? Never seen her before. She's not from our circles. But Alexander ignored them all, focusing entirely on Isla. You don't belong here, he remarked, his voice teasing yet curious. No, she admitted, I don't. And yet here you are. Here I am. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something shift inside him. Something unexpected. Something real. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything changed. This was the moment he unknowingly chose his future wife. The music swelled around them as Alexander led Isla across the dance floor with effortless precision. His touch was firm, commanding, yet there was something in the way he moved that made Isla feel as though she belonged here, even if she knew deep down she didn't. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her senses heightening with every step they took together. The weight of the room's attention fell on them like an oppressive force, but Alexander didn't seem to care. He danced as if no one was watching, and for a fleeting moment, Isla forgot about the whispering socialites, the skeptical glances, the absurdity of the situation. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the dance ended. Alexander released her hand with a slow, deliberate movement, his gaze locked onto hers. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made Isla's breath hitch in her throat. "You intrigue me," he said, his voice smooth yet laced with something deeper. Isla forced a small, wary smile. "I doubt that. I'm hardly anyone of interest." Alexander's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "And yet you are." Before Isla could respond, Damien reappeared beside them, his smirk widening as he took in the sight before him. "Well, well, well. I must say, Alexander, I didn't expect you to find your choice so quickly." Isla frowned, her gaze darting between the two men. "Choice?" Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair before turning his full attention back to her. "Isla, I have a proposition for you." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. "I'm listening," she said cautiously. Alexander leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I need a wife." She blinked, sure she had misheard him. "I'm sorry. What?" "A wife," he repeated. "For reasons I won't bore you with, I need to be married within the next 2 weeks." Isla took a step back, shaking her head. "Are you insane?" A low chuckle escaped Alexander's lips. "I've been accused of worse." "I'm serious," Isla said. "You can't possibly expect me to marry you. We don't even know each other." "That's precisely why this arrangement would work," Alexander countered. "No emotional entanglements, no complications, just a simple business deal." "A business deal." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible, yet delivered with such unwavering confidence that Isla almost considered them. "And what exactly do I get out of this arrangement?" she asked, folding her arms over her chest. Alexander didn't hesitate. "Financial security, freedom. Whatever you need, it's yours." Her mind reeled. Financial security, freedom. For most of her life, Isla had struggled to keep herself afloat, bouncing between low-paying jobs just to afford the basics. She had never belonged to the world Alexander Sinclair occupied, a world of wealth, power, and luxury. And yet here he was offering her a place in it, if only for a short while. It was ridiculous, impossible. "And yet, why me?" she asked quietly. Alexander studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because you have no ties to my world, no hidden agenda. You're the perfect choice." Isla's breath came faster now, her mind racing with possibilities, doubts, and 1,000 unanswered questions. "Think about it," Alexander said, his voice gentler now. "You don't have to decide tonight." But they both knew she already had. Isla didn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned in the small apartment she shared with Sophie, staring at the ceiling as Alexander's proposal played on repeat in her mind. It was insane, absolutely insane. And yet, when the morning light filtered through the thin curtains, she already knew her answer. By the time the sun set that evening, Isla Munro was engaged to Alexander Sinclair. The contract was signed with little ceremony, only a handful of people aware of the arrangement. Isla was given a place to stay, a lavish penthouse in the heart of the city that made her tiny apartment look like a storage closet. Her new life had begun. The wedding was set for the following week, an intimate affair orchestrated by Alexander's legal team to ensure the process was as efficient as possible. No extravagant celebrations, no months-long planning, just a swift exchange of vows to satisfy whatever business requirement had forced Alexander into this position in the first place. And just like that, Isla Munro became Mrs. Sinclair. There was no honeymoon, no whispered promises of forever, just a cold, calculated transaction between two strangers bound by convenience. Or so she thought, because on their wedding night everything changed. The grand Sinclair estate stood like a fortress against the night sky, its towering walls and endless corridors exuding wealth and power. Isla had seen extravagance before, but nothing like this. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's glow. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and old money, and the staff moved about with silent precision, each of them expertly trained to serve without being seen. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a palace, and Isla had just become its reluctant queen. The moment they stepped inside, Alexander loosened his tie and handed it to one of the waiting staff without a word. He didn't glance back to see if Isla was following, didn't offer her any reassurances. He simply walked ahead as though the entire evening had been just another business deal. In many ways it was. A maid escorted Isla to the master bedroom, where a white silk nightgown had been laid out for her. Everything had been arranged so efficiently, so flawlessly, that she felt like a pawn in someone else's game, a role she hadn't agreed to play. She took a slow breath, her fingers grazing the delicate fabric of the gown. "It's just for a while," she reminded herself. "Just 3 months." The contract was clear. This was a temporary marriage, a business arrangement designed to satisfy whatever legal requirement Alexander needed to meet. There were rules, no romantic entanglements, no expectations beyond public appearances, no complications. She could do this, and at least that's what she thought. The soft knock at the door made her jump. Alexander stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence consuming the space effortlessly. He had changed into a crisp black robe, his broad shoulders and sharp jawline giving him an air of effortless authority. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then, in a tone so unreadable it sent chills down her spine, Alexander spoke. "Are you afraid of me, Isla?" She swallowed hard. Was she? "No," she said, lifting her chin. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was something unreadable in his gaze, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "Good." He took a step closer, and suddenly the air between them felt thicker, charged with something neither of them fully understood. Isla wasn't naive. She knew what people assumed about marriage, about wedding nights. But this wasn't a real marriage. There was no love here, no whispered promises of devotion, just a contract, a binding agreement between two strangers. So why did she feel like she was standing at the edge of something undeniably real? Alexander's voice was softer now, almost thoughtful. "I'll sleep in the study," he said. "You'll have this room to yourself." She blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, you... what?" His expression didn't change. "I won't touch you, Isla. That was never part of the agreement." Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. Her heart pounded. "Then why did you marry me?" Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. For the first time since she met him, he looked almost tired. "I had my reasons," he admitted, "and so did you." He wasn't wrong. Isla had agreed to this marriage because it offered her stability, security, and an escape from a life that had never truly been her own. She hadn't thought much about what Alexander got in return. Now she realized she should have, because this man wasn't just playing a game. There were secrets here, secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. But the biggest revelation came next. As Alexander turned to leave, his fingers grazing the door handle, his gaze flickered back to her, his voice dropping just slightly. "One more thing, Isla." She braced herself. Then, with a smirk that sent a strange warmth through her chest, he said, "I know the rumors about you, and I also know they're all lies." The air left her lungs. Her mind went blank. "What?" Alexander's smirk deepened, but his voice held no mockery, only certainty. "I know the truth, Isla." And then he was gone, leaving her stunned, breathless, and more confused than ever. Because the truth he had just spoken was her biggest secret of all. Isla sat on the edge of the massive bed, her heartbeat a chaotic rhythm in her chest. The silence of the room felt deafening, swallowing her whole as Alexander's words echoed in her mind. "I know the truth, Isla." She had spent years perfecting the art of keeping secrets, of hiding behind a carefully crafted image. Yet, in just one sentence, Alexander had shattered the fragile walls she had built around herself. How much did he know? Did he know that the scandalous reputation that followed her like a shadow was nothing more than a fabricated lie? That the rumors whispered in high society about her wild affairs and reckless behavior were stories spun by people who had never known the real her? Most importantly, did he know the secret she had fought so hard to protect? Isla had always been good at pretending, but tonight, for the first time in years, she felt completely exposed. The minutes dragged on, stretching into an eternity. Eventually, she forced herself to move. Changing into the silk nightgown laid out for her, she slid beneath the covers, determined to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily, not when her mind kept replaying the moment Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, and saw through the facade she had spent years maintaining. Who was he, really? She knew he was ruthless in business. That much was clear from the way he carried himself, the way people spoke about him in hushed, reverent tones. But beyond that, he remained a mystery. And Isla hated mysteries. She had spent too much of her life being one. The next morning, she woke to the golden light of dawn filtering through the heavy curtains. The space beside her was empty, untouched, a clear reminder that Alexander had kept his word. For some reason, that realization sent an unexpected pang through her chest. Why do I care? Shaking off the thought, Isla pushed back the covers and made her way to the adjoining bathroom. The ensuite was larger than most apartments, with a marble vanity and a soaking tub that looked like something out of a luxury magazine. The moment she stepped in front of the mirror, she frowned. Her reflection showed the same person she had always been. Long waves of dark brown hair, sharp cheekbones, a stubborn set to her jaw. But somehow she felt different, as if Alexander's words had left an invisible mark on her. By the time she finished getting dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, a soft knock sounded at the door. She turned to find a young maid standing there, her hands neatly folded in front of her. "Good morning, Mrs. Sinclair," the girl said with a polite smile. "Mr. Sinclair is waiting for you in the dining room." It took Isla a moment to process the title. Mrs. Sinclair. It sounded foreign, strange, like a role she wasn't quite sure she was ready to play. But ready or not, she had no choice. Offering a small nod, she followed the maid through the winding halls of the estate, taking in the grandeur that surrounded her. Everything about the Sinclair mansion screamed power, from the high vaulted ceilings to the priceless artwork lining the walls. But beneath the wealth and perfection, there was an underlying sense of emptiness. A house that was beautiful yet cold, just like its owner. By the time they reached the dining hall, Alexander was already seated at the head of a long, polished table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He looked completely at ease, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't dropped a bomb on her last night. "Morning," he greeted, his gaze flicking over her with that same unreadable expression. Isla hesitated for only a moment before taking a seat across from him. The moment she did, a butler appeared, placing a plate of fruit and pastries in front of her. She ignored it. Instead, she leveled him with a direct stare. "What did you mean last night?" Alexander didn't look surprised by the question. Slowly, he set down his cup. "I meant exactly what I said." Isla's fingers tightened around the silverware. "And what exactly do you think you know?" His lips curved into a faint smirk, but his gaze remained sharp. "That you're not who everyone believes you to be." A rush of cold air seemed to pass over her. She had spent so long convincing the world that she was nothing more than a scandalous socialite, a woman who flitted from one extravagant event to the next without a care in the world. But somehow, Alexander had seen past it. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "What makes you think that?" His eyes darkened, but not with anger, with something else, something that sent a shiver through her. "I did my research before proposing this arrangement, Isla," he said smoothly. "I looked into your past, into every story that's ever been written about you, and something didn't add up." She stayed silent. Alexander leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "They say you've been involved with half the billionaires in this city," he continued, voice low. "That you've left a trail of broken hearts and scandals in your wake." Isla met his gaze head-on. And it's all lies." The words settled between them, heavy and absolute. She should have denied it, should have laughed in his face and brushed off his accusations. But something about the certainty in his voice made her pause. Because he was right. The rumors about her were nothing more than carefully crafted illusions, a shield she had built to protect herself. But Alexander Sinclair had just torn it all down with a single sentence. Her heart pounded as she spoke. "What are you going to do with that information?" He studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Sliding it across the table, he said, "Read it." With wary fingers, Isla picked up the paper and unfolded it. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a background report, one detailing her real life, not the version the media had spun. It covered everything: her childhood, her mother's struggles, the sacrifices she had made to keep her family afloat. And worst of all, it confirmed the truth she had worked so hard to bury, the truth that no one, not even her closest friends, knew: her virginity. She had never been the wild woman the tabloids painted her to be. She had never slept her way through the upper class. In fact, she had never been with anyone at all. The revelation settled over the room like a thunderclap. She should have been furious, should have torn the paper in half and thrown it in his face for digging into her personal life. But all she could do was stare. Alexander's voice was softer when he spoke again. "I don't know why you created this image for yourself," he said, "but I do know one thing." She looked up, her pulse racing. "I don't like playing games, Isla, so tell me." His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and unyielding. "What are you really hiding?" Isla's breath hitched as Alexander's words hung between them, heavy and unrelenting. "What are you really hiding?" For a moment she considered lying, throwing him off the scent like she had done with so many others before him. But something about the way he looked at her, the way his gaze refused to waver, made her realize one thing. He already knew the answer. The document in her hands was proof of that. Alexander Sinclair was a lot of things. Ruthless, controlling, infuriatingly perceptive, but he wasn't stupid. If he had uncovered this much about her, then he had already pieced together why she had created the illusion of a reckless socialite. Still, she refused to give him the satisfaction of confirming it. Slowly, she folded the paper back into a neat square and set it down on the table between them. Then, lifting her chin, she met his gaze with an icy calm. "Congratulations," she said smoothly. "You figured out that I'm not as scandalous as the world believes. And what exactly do you plan to do with that information?" Something flickered in his expression, something indecipherable. "You think this is about leverage?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Is that how little you think of me?" Isla let out a quiet scoff. "You tell me, Alexander. You went through all the trouble of digging into my past. What was your plan? To use it against me?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I wanted the truth, nothing more." She narrowed her eyes. "And now that you have it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip before setting the cup back down with deliberate care. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more measured. "Now," he said, "I want to understand." Isla blinked, momentarily thrown off. She had expected threats, accusations, anything but understanding. "I don't need your sympathy," she said flatly. "Good," Alexander replied, "because I'm not offering it." The room fell into silence, charged with an unspoken tension. Isla could feel the weight of his gaze pressing into her, unraveling the layers she had spent years carefully weaving around herself. It was unsettling, exhilarating even. But she couldn't afford to let him in. She had spent too long hiding, too long pretending to let one man undo everything with a single conversation. So she stood. "If this little interrogation is over, I have things to do," she said, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. Alexander's eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't stop her as she turned on her heel and strode toward the exit. But just as she reached the doorway, his voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're running." She froze. Her grip tightened on the door handle, but she didn't turn around. Alexander let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "You can fool everyone else, Isla, but not me." Her jaw clenched. "Damn him. You think you know me?" she said without looking back. "I think I'm starting to," he replied smoothly. Isla hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. For the briefest moment she considered telling him the truth, not just about the facade she had built, but about why she had built it. But fear was a powerful thing, and so, without another word, she walked away. The next few days passed in a blur. Isla busied herself with the meaningless tasks of settling into her new life as Mrs. Sinclair, fitting in final wedding arrangements, meeting with Alexander's family, attending high society luncheons that bored her to tears. Through it all, she maintained her usual mask of poise and indifference, but she could feel him watching her. Every time she entered a room, his gaze followed. Every time they spoke, there was a weight to his words, as if he were waiting for her to slip, to give him something real. And despite herself, Isla hated how aware of him she had become. It wasn't just that Alexander was powerful or devastatingly handsome or dangerously intelligent. It was the fact that for the first time in years, someone was seeing past her walls, and she didn't know how to stop it. One evening, she found herself standing on the balcony of their bedroom, staring out at the vast city skyline. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, carrying the scent of fresh rain and night-blooming flowers. She wasn't sure how long she had been out there when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Alexander stepped beside her, his presence as commanding as ever. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the glittering expanse of the city below. Finally, he spoke. "Do you regret it?" She turned her head slightly, glancing at him. "Regret what?" "This." He gestured vaguely between them. "The marriage. The deal." Isla studied him, searching for hidden meaning in his words. She considered lying, saying that none of it mattered, that she couldn't care less about their arrangement, but instead she surprised herself by telling the truth. "I don't regret it," she admitted quietly, "but I do wonder what would have happened if things had been different." Alexander's gaze sharpened. "Different how?" "If we had met under different circumstances," she murmured. "If there had been no deal, no wager." For the first time she allowed herself to imagine it, a world where they had met not as adversaries, but as equals. Would they still have clashed? Would he still have looked at her the way he did now, with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something unspoken? Would she still have spent her nights lying awake, wondering what it would be like if he truly touched her? She shook the thought away before it could fully form. Alexander was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that caught her completely off guard. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't believe in what-ifs," he said softly, "but I do believe in choices." Isla swallowed hard. "And what choice are you making?" His gaze burned into hers, unwavering. "To see this through, whatever it becomes." Her heart skipped a beat, because for the first time it didn't feel like a game, and that terrified her more than anything else. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of everything Isla had carefully constructed. She had been prepared for this marriage to be a game of endurance, a carefully controlled charade where both she and Alexander played their parts to perfection. But somewhere along the way, the lines had begun to blur. It started in small ways. The way he reached for her hand during social gatherings, not out of obligation but out of something else, something almost natural. The way his gaze lingered just a little too long, as if he were searching for something in her that she wasn't sure she even had to give. The way his voice softened when he spoke her name in private, as if it mattered. And worst of all, the way she had begun to crave those moments. She told herself that it was nothing, that it was just the side effect of being constantly around him, of having to pretend for so long that it was beginning to feel real. But then, there were the nights. Nights where Alexander would return from late meetings, his tie loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking like the very definition of power and control. And yet, instead of heading straight to bed or retreating into his office, he would find her. Sometimes it was in the library where she would be curled up with a book, only to look up and find him watching her from the doorway. Other times it was in the sitting room, where he would pour himself a drink and sit beside her in silence, as if the presence of another human being was something he had only just begun to appreciate. And then, there were the nights when neither of them spoke at all, when the air between them was thick with something unspoken, something that neither of them dared name. One such night, Isla found herself in the kitchen long past midnight, pouring herself a glass of water when she heard the low sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, already knowing who it was. Alexander stood in the doorway, his gaze unreadable. "You can't sleep either?" he asked. She shook her head. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, stopping only when he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that all she had to do was tilt her head slightly, and... She forced herself to take a step back, placing the kitchen island between them. Alexander's gaze flickered, but he didn't move. "This wasn't part of the deal," she murmured. Something dark passed through his expression. "Is that what this still is to you? A deal?" She opened her mouth to answer, to say yes, to remind him that they were nothing more than a transaction. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere along the way it had stopped feeling like that. She saw it in the way he looked at her, in the way he touched her, even when no one was watching, in the way he was giving her a choice. She swallowed hard. "It has to be." For a long moment Alexander said nothing. Then, with a quiet exhale, he nodded once and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, he paused. "When you're ready to stop pretending," he said softly, "you know where to find me." And then he was gone. The next morning, Isla woke up with a sense of unease curling in her chest. She had spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every single moment between them, every touch, every glance, every near almost. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to be in control. She was supposed to be untouchable. And yet, Alexander Sinclair was slipping under her skin like a carefully whispered secret, unraveling her with every passing second. She needed space, which was why, instead of going to the office that morning, she found herself in the stables, saddling one of the estate's horses for a ride through the countryside. She had always loved riding. It was one of the few things in her life that still felt entirely hers. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. The crisp morning air rushed against her skin as she urged the horse forward, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the dirt path grounding her in a way that nothing else could. For a while, she let herself forget. Forget about the way Alexander looked at her. Forget about the way his voice made her stomach tighten in ways she didn't want to admit. Forget about the fact that, despite everything, she was starting to want. She wasn't sure how long she had been riding when she heard the distant sound of another set of hooves approaching. She turned just in time to see Alexander riding toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're avoiding me," he said as he pulled his horse alongside hers. Isla scoffed. "I'm enjoying my morning ride." Alexander studied her, his gaze sharp. "You never told me you rode. You never asked." His lips twitched slightly, but there was something in his expression that made her pulse race. Without another word, he nudged his horse forward, challenging her with nothing more than a look. She didn't even hesitate. She kicked her horse into a gallop, the wind whipping through her hair as she pushed forward, the thrill of competition sparking something electric between them. Alexander was right beside her, matching her pace effortlessly. For a moment, she almost forgot why she had been avoiding him in the first place. Almost. When they finally slowed to a stop near a small clearing, both of them were breathing hard, their faces flushed from the ride. That was... Isla shook her head, laughing breathlessly. "I haven't done that in years." Alexander was watching her again, but this time there was something softer in his gaze, something that made her chest tighten. "You should," he said simply. "You look happy." Isla stilled. She wasn't sure what startled her more, the fact that he had noticed, or the fact that she was happy. She had spent so long running, so long pretending that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Alexander's gaze flickered to her lips. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. And then, without thinking, Isla leaned in. It was only the slightest movement, barely even noticeable, but he saw it. His breath hitched, his hands tightening slightly on the reins. Then, just as quickly as the moment came, it was gone. Alexander straightened, his expression carefully neutral. "We should head back," he said quietly. Isla nodded, forcing herself to look away, because for the first time since this marriage began, she was beginning to realize a terrifying truth. She wasn't just playing a role anymore, and neither was he. The night after the gala, Isla couldn't sleep. She lay in her massive bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, the way Alexander had looked at her, the way his voice had dropped when he said he wasn't playing anymore, the way her own body had betrayed her, staying rooted in place when she should have walked away. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she knew one thing. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience anymore. Not for either of them, and that terrified her. The next morning, Isla did what she did best. She ignored it. She went about her day as if nothing had changed, keeping to her own schedule, refusing to acknowledge the tension that had settled between them. But Alexander, he wasn't making it easy. He had always been composed, always measured. But now there was something different in the way he interacted with her, something more deliberate. At breakfast, he lingered at the table longer than usual, watching her with an expression that made her feel like he was trying to read her. At meetings, he stood closer than necessary, his presence impossible to ignore. At night, when they returned to their wing of the estate, he didn't just disappear into his study like before. He stayed, silent, waiting, like he was daring her to acknowledge what was happening. But Isla wasn't ready to do that yet, because admitting it would mean admitting that the walls she had built were starting to crack. A week passed like this, tension so thick it was suffocating, until finally everything snapped. It happened late one evening. She'd been reading in the library, curled up in the oversized leather chair near the fireplace, when Alexander walked in. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him, but she felt him. The room shifted with his presence, the air growing heavier. And then, without a word, he walked over and took the book from her hands. She blinked up at him, startled. "Excuse me?" Alexander looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding me," he said simply. She scoffed, reaching for her book. "I have not." He held it out of her reach. "Then look me in the eyes and say it." Her jaw clenched. She could play this game too, so she did. She tilted her chin, met his gaze head-on, and said, "I am not avoiding you." Alexander's lips curved slightly. Liar. Her stomach twisted, because they both knew she was. He leaned down, planting one hand on the armrest beside her, effectively caging her in. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer force of his presence, but she refused to react. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "If you have something to say, Alexander," she said coolly, "say it." He studied her for a long moment. Then his voice dropped to something dangerous. "I think you're afraid." She laughed, but it came out too sharp, too defensive. Afraid? Of what? His eyes flicked to her lips, back to her eyes, and then lower and lower. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Of what happens when you stop pretending you don't feel this too." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Because they hit too close to home, and because she knew, deep down, he was right. She didn't want to feel anything for him. She didn't want to let him get under her skin, but she already had. And that was the real problem. She could push him away. She could end this before it started. But as she looked up at him, heart pounding, breath uneven, she didn't move, and neither did he. The moment stretched between them, electric and dangerous, until finally, Alexander exhaled a quiet laugh, shook his head, and stepped back. "Good night, Isla." And then just like that, he walked away, leaving her breathless, shaken, and more confused than she had ever been in her life. But Isla knew one thing. She could only run from this for so long, and sooner or later, she was going to have to face it. The days that followed felt like a slow-burning fire, one neither of them were willing to put out. Alexander had changed the game, and Isla could feel it in every interaction, every stolen glance, every unspoken word between them. He was no longer keeping his distance. He was waiting for her to acknowledge the shift, for her to react. And that terrified her more than anything, because every time she looked at him, she felt everything she had been trying to suppress, and it was getting harder to pretend otherwise. Then came the night of the fundraiser gala. It was an event Isla had to attend, one of the biggest of the year, hosted by one of Alexander's business partners, filled with the most powerful names in the industry. She had attended dozens of these before. They were routine, expected, but tonight felt different, and maybe it was the dress. Sleek black silk that hugged every inch of her, chosen by Alexander himself. Maybe it was the way he looked at her when she stepped into the grand foyer before they left. His gaze darkened, his jaw ticked, and for a moment he didn't speak at all. He just watched her, slowly, like he was memorizing every inch of her. But when he finally moved, it wasn't to offer a compliment. It was to step closer, adjust the delicate bracelet on her wrist, and murmur, "Stay close to me tonight." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but before she could ask why, he was already leading her toward the car. At the gala, the tension only worsened. From the outside, they played their roles perfectly. Alexander Whitmore, the untouchable billionaire. Isla Whitmore, his effortlessly poised wife. But underneath the surface, something was brewing. She could feel it, like a storm waiting to break. And it only intensified when Alexander's ex, Sienna Rhodes, arrived. Sienna was beautiful, confident, and exactly the kind of woman people had once expected Alexander to end up with. Not Isla. She wasn't supposed to be part of the equation. She wasn't supposed to be the woman standing beside him. And yet here she was. And Sienna did not like that. Isla saw it in the way the woman's smile barely reached her eyes, in the way she lingered too long when she greeted Alexander, in the way she leaned in, just enough to make a statement, before purring, "I didn't expect to see you so settled." Alexander's grip on his glass tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously smooth. "I didn't expect to either." Sienna's gaze flickered toward Isla. Then, as if it was a simple fact, she said, "I give it a year." Silence. The insult hung in the air, subtle but sharp enough to draw blood. And Isla knew this was a test and a challenge. Would she take the bait? Would she react? Would she prove that she didn't belong in Alexander's world? But Isla was done playing by their rules. She met Sienna's gaze head-on, tilted her head, and then with a slow, knowing smile, she reached for Alexander's hand. threaded their fingers together, and purred back, "Funny, I was thinking forever." Sienna's expression froze. Alexander? His thumb brushed against Isla's palm, a barely there touch, but she felt it everywhere, like a silent applause, like he was telling her, "That's my girl," and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just playing a role, she felt like she belonged. But the night wasn't over yet. Hours later, after countless conversations and polite smiles, Alexander finally pulled her onto the grand balcony overlooking the city. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, staring at the skyline, the cool night air swirling around them. Then Alexander sighed. "You didn't have to do that." Isla glanced at him. "Do what?" "Defend us, United States." Her chest tightened. "Someone had to," she murmured. Alexander turned toward her, and for the first time in weeks he dropped the act, the cool exterior, the unshakable control. All of it melted away, and in its place, something raw, something real. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Isla." Her breath caught. His voice was low, but the weight of his words pressed into her like a confession, like a decision had already been made. She swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Alexander reached for her, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and then, "It means I'm done fighting this." The moment hung between them, a single step, a single breath, the space between past and present, between fear and something deeper, between running and finally staying. And Isla knew. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The tension between them was suffocating, charged with something neither of them could ignore any longer. Isla felt it in the way Alexander stood before her, his normally cool, unshakable demeanor nowhere to be found. This wasn't the Alexander Whitmore the world knew. This was the man she had glimpsed in stolen moments, the one who looked at her like she wasn't just an arrangement, wasn't just a contract, but something more. But Isla didn't move, and she couldn't, because she knew if she did, if she gave in even a little, there would be no pretending after this. No pretending she wasn't falling for a man she wasn't supposed to love. No pretending he wasn't changing the game on her. No pretending that this arrangement wasn't turning into something real. Alexander took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. "Say something," he murmured. She shook her head. "I don't know what to say." His jaw tightened. His eyes burned into hers, unreadable. Then, softer this time. "Tell me you don't feel it." Her breath hitched, the way he said it. Like he already knew the answer, like he already knew that every time she looked at him, she felt this pull, this ache, this impossible, inescapable thing between them. But admitting it, that was dangerous, that was reckless, that was falling all the way in. So instead, she turned away. "Alexander." "Isla." His voice was lower now, rougher. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't do this." "Do what?" "This." She exhaled sharply. "Whatever this is. We both know how this ends. It's a contract. It was always a contract." Silence. Then, "That's not what it is anymore." Her head snapped up, eyes searching his. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he took another step forward, crowding her against the balcony railing, "that I don't want a contract." Her chest tightened. "I don't want a deal, Isla." She swallowed hard. He was too close now, the world around them blurred. Just them and the city lights and the weight of everything left unsaid. She whispered, "Then what do you want?" Alexander's fingers brushed against her jaw, tilting her face up to his. His eyes, dark and piercing, held her there. "I want you." Everything stopped. The air between them, the noise of the city, the carefully constructed distance they had spent months maintaining. It all disappeared. And for the first time, Isla had no idea what to do. No idea how to run from this. How to ignore the way her pulse raced, how every part of her was screaming to close the space between them. But before she could answer, before she could even process what was happening, someone called his name. They both turned. At the entrance of the balcony stood his father, Thomas Whitmore, and judging by the sharpness in his gaze, the disapproval etched into every inch of his expression, he had seen enough. "Alexander," his father's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous. "We need to talk." Alexander's entire body went rigid, because he knew exactly what this was. His father never interfered unless it was serious, unless he was about to destroy something. And right now, Alexander had no doubt. He was here to destroy this moment, this feeling, This thing that had somehow turned into more than an arrangement. Slowly, Alexander exhaled, his hands falling away from Isla. But before he left, before he turned and followed his father inside, he met her gaze one last time. And there, in his eyes, she saw it. The promise. The silent, unspoken truth neither of them had been willing to say out loud. This wasn't over. Not yet. Not ever. Inside, the tension was suffocating. His father stood by the large window of the estate's private lounge, fingers wrapped around a glass of scotch, watching the city below. Alexander knew this game well, knew exactly how his father operated, so he didn't say anything. Not yet. He just waited. And finally, after a long silence, his father sighed. "I thought we agreed," Thomas said, voice deceptively calm, "that this marriage was just business." Alexander clenched his jaw. "It is." His father turned then, studying him. "Then why do you look at her like that?" "Like what? Like she was more than a contract? Like she was more than something to be controlled? Like he actually cared?" Alexander didn't answer, which was enough of an answer. His father took a slow sip of his drink. Then, evenly, he said, "End it." Alexander stilled. Thomas continued, unbothered. "Get rid of her, before this turns into something you can't walk away from." A slow, dangerous fire burned in Alexander's chest. "She's my wife." His father gave a sharp, unimpressed smile. "She's a contract, don't get confused." Silence, thick, unyielding, until his father sighed again as if bored of the conversation already. "Alexander," he set down his glass, "you've done well. You've built your empire. You've proven yourself to me, to the board, to the world." He paused. "But don't make the mistake of choosing something that will make you weak." Weak. The word lingered and hung there like a noose. And Alexander understood exactly what this was. A test. One last, final test. To see if he was still his father's son. Still the man his father created him to be. But for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to pass. Isla paced the bedroom, her thoughts a mess. Something had changed tonight. Alexander had changed tonight. And she didn't know what to do about it, because as much as she wanted to pretend she didn't care, she did. God, she did. But what scared her the most? She didn't know if she was willing to lose herself to him. Not when there was so much at stake. Not when she had spent years learning how to survive on her own. But then, the door opened. She turned, and there he was. Alexander stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. And yet, she knew everything had just changed. That whatever happened next, whatever choice he had just made, it would decide everything. "Alexander," she whispered. And finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he exhaled, then with quiet, unwavering certainty, "I choose you." If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Stay tuned, because the next twist is just around the corner.